Emily stepped onto the plane early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the airport tarmac. She had been a flight attendant for years, but something about this flight felt different. There was a buzz in the air. The crew members exchanged glances as they prepared for the long journey ahead from New York to London. This was a regular flight for the airline, but there was a very special passenger on board today, one who had booked the entire first-class section. She didn't know much about him, only that his name was listed as Jonathan Winters. And there were whispers among the staff that he was a billionaire from some tech empire. She had served plenty of wealthy passengers before, so she didn't think much of it. They were often demanding or strange, but they were still just passengers. She had a job to do, and that was all that mattered. Emily made her rounds greeting the passengers in business class. Before moving up to first class, she walked down the aisle with her trolley and felt eyes on her. The passengers in first class were all looking at their screens or reading the newspapers, but there was one man whose gaze caught hers. He was sitting near the window looking out at the runway. His face was obscured by a large pair of sunglasses, but there was something about him, something that made her pause for just a second. His calm demeanor was unsettling. She continued down the aisle, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying her. As the plane took off, Emily went through the usual motions, checking seat belts, ensuring the safety procedures were followed. She kept her eyes on the passengers. As the plane ascended, the engines roared, and the seatbelt sign flickered off. She began to prepare for the in-flight service when a soft voice interrupted her. "Excuse me, miss." Emily turned to find the man with the sunglasses staring at her. His voice was smooth, almost too smooth, but there was something compelling about it. "Yes, sir, can I help you?" she replied with a professional smile, though she was already feeling an odd sense of unease. "I need you to do something for me." His voice was calm but firm, as if he was used to getting exactly what he wanted. Emily nodded, not thinking much of it. "What can I do for you, sir?" she asked. "I'd like to change my seat," he said matter-of-factly. "I prefer more privacy. I want to move to the back of the plane." Emily blinked in surprise. She had never had a passenger ask for a seat change mid-flight, especially not from first class to economy. It was unheard of. She was about to decline. When she saw his eyes, his gaze was intense, and yet there was an unsettling warmth to it, like a predator who had already made up his mind about everything. She felt a chill crawl up her spine, but she quickly pushed it aside. "I'm afraid, sir, that's not possible," she said politely. "You're seated in first class, and we're currently in the middle of service." The man didn't react immediately. He just continued to look at her for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he leaned back in his seat, and with a small nod of his head, he said, "That's fine," and turned his attention back to the window, as if the conversation had never happened. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted, something had changed in the air around them. As the flight continued, Emily moved down the aisles, distributing snacks and drinks to passengers. But her mind kept returning to the strange encounter with Jonathan Winters. She couldn't explain why his simple request had unsettled her so much. It was just a seat change. After all, something that didn't even seem like a big deal. Yet the way he had looked at her had been different, almost calculating. There was an air of authority to him that she wasn't used to encountering on her flights. Usually passengers were either respectful or oblivious to her presence, but Jonathan Winters had a way of making her feel like she was a part of something much bigger, something she didn't understand. As the cabin lights dimmed and passengers settled into their routines, Emily tried to focus on the tasks at hand. She checked on the bathrooms and made sure the cabin was comfortable for the long flight. But every now and then her eyes would wander back to first class. She couldn't help it. Jonathan was still there, his sunglasses perched on his nose, as he seemed to disappear into his own world. He wasn't interacting with anyone else, not even the other passengers who were trying to strike up conversations with him. The man was an enigma. It wasn't long before Emily noticed the crew members around her were beginning to exchange whispers, and glances. Some of the other flight attendants had started to gossip about him. One mentioned that he owned multiple companies and was rumored to be one of the wealthiest people in the world. Others speculated that he had business dealings with the highest levels of government, and that no one really knew the full extent of his wealth or influence. Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of the words, as if they were a warning she didn't need to be told that someone like him had the power to make or break careers. Hours passed, and Emily could feel her unease growing. She kept thinking about his request, and how easily he had accepted her refusal. Something about it gnawed at her, and made her question her decision. She had felt confident at the time, but now doubt was creeping in. What if she had made a mistake? What if this man wasn't just some billionaire on a private jet, but someone who expected respect, someone who had the power to ruin her life with a single word? She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away, but they lingered like a dark cloud over her mind. Just as she was about to check on the passengers again, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Emily turned around and found Jonathan Winters standing just behind her. His face was expressionless, but his eyes locked onto hers with a quiet intensity. He didn't speak at first, just watched her with that unnerving gaze, and Emily's pulse quickened. She took a small step back, unsure of what to expect. "I was thinking about our conversation earlier," he finally said, his voice still calm and smooth, but there was an underlying tension to it. "And I wanted to let you know that I understand your position." Emily felt a flicker of relief at his words, but it was fleeting. However, he continued, his tone suddenly shifting. "There are consequences to ignoring someone like me. You'll learn that soon enough." And with that he turned and walked away without another word. Emily stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't quite process what had just happened. It had been so casual, yet the weight of his words was undeniable. She had thought the situation was over, but now it felt like it was just beginning. She glanced around the cabin to see if anyone had noticed, but the passengers were either asleep or occupied with their own affairs. The flight continued as if nothing had happened, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She didn't know who Jonathan Winters truly was, but she had a sinking feeling she was about to find out in a way she wouldn't forget. The hours dragged on, and Emily could feel the unease building like a storm on the horizon. The flight was quiet now. Most passengers were asleep, but Emily couldn't find any rest. Her thoughts kept returning to Jonathan Winters and the cryptic words he had said to her. She knew he hadn't been joking. She didn't know why, but she could sense it in the way he looked at her. His calm demeanor was a facade hiding something dangerous, something powerful. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a huge mistake by brushing him off earlier. Around midnight, the plane hit some turbulence, and the cabin lights flickered briefly. It wasn't anything unusual, but it was enough to disrupt the calm atmosphere. Emily felt her heart race as the plane dipped slightly and the seatbelt sign came on. She went into autopilot mode, immediately checking on the passengers, reassuring them that everything was fine. But as she moved down the aisle, her eyes flicked to Jonathan's seat, and she saw him sitting up straight, his gaze fixed on her once again. He didn't appear concerned about the turbulence like everyone else. His eyes were sharp, almost predatory. It sent another chill down her spine. She quickly turned away and focused on the task at hand, but his presence lingered like a shadow over her movements. The turbulence soon passed, but Emily couldn't calm her nerves. She found herself glancing at the clock every few minutes. The flight seemed to stretch on forever. When it was finally time for the next meal service, Emily found herself hesitating as she approached first class. She had seen Jonathan sitting there, staring out the window as he had before, but now something felt different. The atmosphere around him had shifted. He was no longer the calm, mysterious billionaire he had been earlier. Now he had an air of command about him, almost like a king surveying his kingdom. Emily had a sinking feeling that whatever happened next would change everything. She took a deep breath and walked up to him with a polite smile. "Mr. Winters, may I get you anything to eat or drink?" she asked, her voice steady, but her hands were shaking slightly. Jonathan looked at her for a long moment without speaking. He seemed to be studying her, as if trying to decide whether or not she was worthy of a response. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll have the champagne," he said finally, his voice smooth and deliberate, "but don't bring it to me just yet." Emily nodded, confused, but she turned to retrieve his drink, still feeling the weight of his eyes on her back. As she walked away, when she returned with the champagne, she hesitated at first, unsure of how to approach the situation. She could feel the tension building in the air as she approached his seat, but when she looked up at him again, she saw that he wasn't looking at her. Instead, he was watching something else, a small laptop that he had taken out from his bag, and was typing on with quick, precise movements. She placed the glass on the tray table in front of him and waited for him to acknowledge her, but he didn't look up or say anything for a long time. Feeling awkward, she cleared her throat. "Mr. Winters, your drink," she said softly. Still no response. He kept typing without breaking his focus. It was as if she didn't exist anymore. Then, without warning, he stopped typing and slowly lifted his head, his eyes locked onto hers. And in that moment, Emily felt a cold wave wash over her. It wasn't anger or even annoyance. It was something far more unsettling, something deeper, as if he knew everything about her, every flaw, every hesitation, every moment of weakness. He could see right through her. She swallowed hard and took a small step back. "You don't seem to understand yet," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it cut through the air with chilling clarity. "When someone like me asks for something, it isn't a request, it's an order." Emily's stomach churned. She stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. She had heard stories before about powerful people who used their influence to get what they wanted, but this was different. Jonathan Winters wasn't just powerful, he was dangerous, and she had no idea how deep his reach really went. Emily stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The words he had just spoken lingered in the air like a heavy fog, and she couldn't escape them no matter how hard she tried. She had heard hints of power before, stories of businessmen who held sway over the lives of others. But this felt different. This felt like something that reached beyond what she understood. Jonathan Winters wasn't just a billionaire, he was a force, and she was caught in his path. She quickly composed herself and took a step back, trying to regain control of the situation, but the cold chill that had settled in her stomach refused to leave. She glanced at the other passengers, who were either asleep or lost in their own worlds. No one seemed to notice the tension between her and the billionaire, but she could feel it building like a storm on the horizon. She knew that she couldn't ignore what had just happened. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine anymore. But she also knew that nothing would be the same if she confronted him, if she dared to challenge him again. She had no idea what he was capable of, or how far his influence truly reached. As she walked away from first class, her mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. She tried to tell herself it was all just a misunderstanding, that maybe she was overthinking things. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She had seen the look in his eyes, the cold, detached way he had spoken to her. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The rest of the flight seemed to drag on forever. Emily tried to focus on her duties as best she could, but every time she moved down the aisle, her gaze would flicker back to Jonathan's seat. She would see him there still and unmoving, his face expressionless, as he sat in the dim light of the cabin, like a shadow looming over her every step. But as the hours passed and the night wore on, Emily began to feel a strange shift. Something in the air seemed to change. It was subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. The usual calmness of the flight attendants had been replaced with an uneasy tension that seemed to spread throughout the cabin. Even the other crew members were acting differently. They exchanged nervous glances and whispered quietly to each other, but no one spoke of what was truly going on. Emily could feel the weight of their silence, and it only added to her growing unease. Then came the announcement. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, and his words sent a ripple of confusion through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered an issue with one of the engines. We're currently experiencing some turbulence, but rest assured we are taking every precaution to ensure your safety. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened until further notice." The plane shuddered as the turbulence hit again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the usual bumps and shakes. This was stronger, the kind of turbulence that made people grip their armrests and whisper in fear. Emily felt the plane dip slightly, her stomach lurching with the sudden change in altitude. She moved quickly down the aisle, checking on passengers, doing her best to stay calm. But as she passed by Jonathan's seat again, she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. Jonathan was no longer sitting quietly in his seat. He was standing now, his eyes locked onto her once more, and this time there was no hint of warmth, no friendly gesture, just cold intensity. He didn't look scared like the others, who were clutching their seats or gripping the armrests. No, Jonathan looked almost pleased, as if he were enjoying the chaos unfolding around them. He watched her for a moment before his lips parted, and he spoke again. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, his voice low and calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She felt her body tense. But before she could respond, the plane jolted violently, and the lights flickered once more. The passengers gasped, and there was a collective wave of panic. As the turbulence grew more intense, the fasten seatbelt sign flashed on once again. But Emily couldn't look away from Jonathan. She couldn't shake the feeling that his calmness in the middle of the chaos was more than just a coincidence. It was as if he had known this would happen, as if he had set it all in motion. The plane jolted again, and this time it was worse. The turbulence seemed to shake the entire cabin. Passengers cried out in alarm. Some were clutching their seats, while others were praying under their breath. The lights flickered overhead, and a cold sweat broke out on Emily's forehead. She moved quickly down the aisle, trying to calm the panicked passengers. But all the while her eyes kept darting back to Jonathan Winters. He was still seated in first class, his expression unchanged, as if the chaos around him didn't faze him at all. It was as if he knew exactly what was coming next. The plane shook harder and harder. Emily's stomach twisted into knots as she tried to steady herself. She had been on countless flights before, but this felt different. This felt like something was wrong, something more than just the weather or a mechanical issue. The air seemed thick with tension, as though something far more sinister was unfolding in front of her. She reached the back of the cabin and checked on the passengers in economy, trying to distract herself from the growing unease that gnawed at her. The sound of the engines seemed to change suddenly. There was a strange whirring noise that made her blood run cold. It wasn't right. It was too unnatural, too unsettling. She turned to one of the senior flight attendants, hoping for some reassurance, but the older woman's face was pale and tight with fear. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered urgently. The senior attendant nodded grimly. "Something's wrong," she murmured under her breath. Before Emily could respond, the intercom crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't the captain's voice that came through the speakers. It was a low, distorted sound, almost like a growl or a hum that made her skin crawl. She froze for a moment, unsure if she had imagined it. But then the voice came again, much clearer this time. "Attention all passengers. Please remain calm. This flight is being diverted to an alternate location. Do not attempt to leave your seats. Do not panic. Stay where you are and wait for further instructions." The words sent a wave of fear through the cabin, and for the first time Emily saw the full extent of the passengers' panic. Screams filled the air, and people scrambled to grip their seatbelts. As the plane rocked again, the atmosphere was thick with confusion and terror. But through it all, Emily's gaze was drawn to Jonathan, who hadn't moved an inch, his eyes still locked on her, his face betraying no hint of emotion. But there was something in his eyes, something darker than before, a glint of cold satisfaction that made her heart race even faster. It was as if he was orchestrating everything around him, pulling the strings, while the rest of them were left to wonder what was happening and why. Emily's hands trembled as she fumbled for the intercom to speak to the passengers, but the voice came again. This time it was louder and clearer. "Remain in your seats. The plane will land in 20 minutes. Please prepare for emergency procedures." The announcement echoed through the cabin, and a sense of dread washed over Emily. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't think, she only knew one thing for certain: whatever was happening, it was connected to Jonathan Winters, and he was at the center of it all. She glanced at the senior attendant again, but the woman was already moving down the aisle, shouting orders to other crew members to prepare for the emergency landing. Emily didn't know what to do. She had to do something, but her body felt frozen with fear, her mind racing, as she thought back to the warning he had given her earlier: "You'll understand soon enough." Those words echoed in her mind louder than any sound in the plane. The fear, the uncertainty, everything pointed to him. And yet she couldn't understand. Why had he warned her? What did he want from her? The plane continued to shake violently now. There was no denying that something was horribly wrong. Emily stumbled back to first class, her heart in her throat, her thoughts a blur. When she reached Jonathan's seat, he wasn't there. He was gone. There was no sign of him, no trace of his presence, except for the empty seat. His luggage was gone, and the curtain dividing first class from the rest of the cabin had been pulled shut. She stood frozen in the aisle, staring at the space where he had been moments ago. As the chaos around her continued to unfold, she couldn't make sense of it all. Why had he left? Where had he gone? And what did it mean for them all? Emily stood frozen in the aisle, staring at the empty seat where Jonathan had been moments ago. Her heart was pounding, and her mind was racing as the panic around her intensified. The plane was still shaking violently. The air was thick with fear and confusion, but all Emily could think about was Jonathan Winters. Where had he gone? How had he vanished so quickly? And why did it feel like he was still somehow pulling the strings behind the scenes? The cabin was in chaos. Passengers were shouting, some were crying, others were praying, all of them trying to make sense of the emergency landing that had just been announced. But Emily felt an overwhelming sense of isolation, as if she were trapped in a nightmare and couldn't wake up. She moved quickly down the aisle, trying to focus on her training, trying to do her job, but her mind kept drifting back to the man who had changed everything, the man whose presence seemed to bend reality itself. She glanced around at the other crew members, but they were all preoccupied with their own tasks. No one seemed to notice the emptiness of first class. No one seemed to care that Jonathan was gone. She reached the front of the plane and tried to get some answers from the cockpit, but the door was locked, and there was no response from the crew. Her heart sank further as she realized the full extent of the situation. No one seemed to be in control anymore. No one had any answers. It was as if the entire flight had slipped into a state of madness, where nothing made sense and everything was falling apart. Then it hit her like a sudden wave of realization. Jonathan hadn't just left. He had orchestrated all of this. Somehow he had made it happen. The turbulence, the strange announcements, the emergency landing, they were all connected to him. It was as if he had set the stage for something much bigger, and Emily was caught in the middle of it. But what did he want from her? What did he want from all of them? She felt a wave of nausea hit her as the gravity of the situation settled in. She had been a part of something she couldn't understand, something that was spiraling out of control, and she had no idea how to stop it. The plane lurched again, and Emily grabbed the nearest seat to steady herself as the overhead lights flickered once more. A cold chill swept through the cabin, and she felt a sudden urge to look back at first class. Without even thinking, she turned her head. But this time it wasn't just the empty seat that caught her attention. It was the figure standing at the front of the cabin near the cockpit door. Jonathan. He was standing there calmly, as if nothing was wrong, as if the entire plane hadn't just been thrown into a state of chaos. and fear his sunglasses were back on, and his face was impassive. But there was something in the way he held himself, something in the way he looked at her, that made her blood run cold. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come, he was so close now, and yet he might as well have been a world away. He hadn't spoken a word to anyone, but Emily could feel the weight of his gaze, as if he were silently watching her. Every move. His presence was overwhelming, and it was impossible to ignore. And then he spoke, his voice cutting through the noise of the panicked passengers and the turbulence with cold precision. Everyone calmed down. His voice was clear and authoritative, as if he had the power to command the plane itself. There is no emergency, everything is under control. You just don't know it yet, but you will soon enough. He said, his eyes never leaving hers. You see, Emily, this is all part of the plan. This was always going to happen. I simply needed to set the stage for you to understand. Her breath caught in her throat, his words sending a shockwave through her body. Everything in her wanted to run, but she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the weight of his gaze. You'll see soon enough, he repeated, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles as he turned and walked toward the cockpit. The silence that followed felt deafening. The chaos in the cabin continued, but it was distant now, like a faint echo of something that no longer mattered. Emily's heart was racing. She could feel her pulse in her throat, but she couldn't move. She couldn't think. She only knew one thing now: Jonathan Winters wasn't just a passenger on this flight. He was the puppet master, controlling everything from the shadows, and she was about to find out just how deep his influence ran. Emily stood motionless, her heart hammering in her chest. As Jonathan's footsteps faded toward the cockpit, the chaos around her seemed to grow distant, as if the world had narrowed down to just her and him. She couldn't shake the image of him, standing there so calm, so composed in the midst of the panic. She tried to push the thoughts aside and focus on the situation at hand, but everything felt wrong. The turbulence hadn't stopped. The plane still lurched unpredictably, and the cabin was filled with the sound of anxious murmurs. But Emily couldn't bring herself to care about anything else. All she could think about was Jonathan, his words, his presence. Everything about him screamed control, but control over what was his plan? Why had he chosen her? Why had he singled her out? She finally shook herself from the trance and began moving down the aisle once again. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, but she had to keep herself together. She had to keep doing her job. For the sake of the passengers, she approached the senior flight attendant, who was hurriedly preparing for the emergency landing. But the woman didn't look at her. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes wide with a fear Emily hadn't seen in her before. "Have you heard from the cockpit?" Emily asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly. The senior attendant looked at her, then quickly looked away, as if she didn't want to meet her gaze. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're not answering. I tried to reach them, but there's nothing." Emily's breath caught. She turned toward the cockpit door, but the way it loomed in front of her now felt ominous. She knew something was wrong, something far more dangerous than just a plane malfunction. Her instincts were screaming at her to stay away, but she couldn't help herself. She had to know what was happening. She had to understand. Without thinking, she moved toward the cockpit door, her footsteps echoing loudly in the silence of the cabin. The noise outside seemed to be muffled. As she reached for the handle, her hand hovered for a moment, unsure, but then she twisted it, and the door creaked open slightly. Inside, the cockpit was empty. The seats were both unoccupied, and the flight controls were unmanned. The instruments on the dashboard blinked erratically. The lights were flickering, and the air felt thick, with a tension that was almost suffocating. Emily stepped back in shock, her mind racing, as she tried to process what she was seeing. How could the cockpit be empty? How could no one be flying the plane? And then she heard it, the low hum again, the strange distorted noise from earlier. It was coming from somewhere behind her. She spun around, but no one was there. The plane shook again. As the hum grew louder, it seemed to be emanating from the very walls of the aircraft itself, and the unsettling feeling in her chest grew stronger. Her heart was pounding now. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The strange hum seemed to pulse through her like a physical force. She stumbled backward out of the cockpit, her hands shaking. She was about to turn and run, when she heard the sound of footsteps approaching the door to the cockpit slammed shut behind her, and she spun around to see Jonathan standing there, once again calm and unbothered, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. He didn't even glance at her. He simply stood there and stared ahead. "You should have stayed where you were." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying coldness to it that sent chills down her spine. Emily's mouth went dry. Her mind couldn't form words. She wanted to scream, to ask him what was going on, but the words wouldn't come. The hum in the air seemed to grow louder as he stepped toward her, his eyes cold and calculating. "It's too late now," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You've seen too much, and now you're a part of it, whether you like it or not." Emily took a step back, but her legs felt like leads. She wanted to run, but something kept her rooted to the spot. She felt as if she were trapped in some kind of nightmare, and Jonathan was the architect of it all. Everything was falling apart, and she was powerless to stop it. The plane lurched violently again. The lights flickered once more, and the hum grew deafening. The walls seemed to vibrate, and the very air felt charged with something she couldn't explain. She looked at Jonathan, but his face betrayed no emotion. He was calm, detached, as if he had orchestrated everything around them, and now he was simply waiting for the inevitable to unfold. "You'll understand soon enough." He repeated the same words he had said earlier, but now they had a different meaning. They were a warning, a final declaration of what was to come, and Emily realized with growing horror that there was nothing she could do to change it, nothing she could do to stop him. The plane shuddered violently as the hum in the air intensified, and Emily's heart raced. She could feel the vibrations in her chest as the walls of the aircraft seemed to pulse around her. Jonathan stood there, unmoved, his expression unreadable, his cold gaze never leaving her. She wanted to scream, but the words died in her throat. The air felt thick with dread, and she could barely breathe. She couldn't understand what was happening or how any of this was real, but she knew one thing for sure: she was caught in a trap, and Jonathan Winters had set the bait. "You don't understand, do you?" Jonathan's voice sliced through the chaos, his tone cold and emotionless, but there was something there beneath it, a quiet menace that sent a chill down her spine. He took a slow step forward, and she instinctively stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. The plane had become a cage, and he was its master. "You're not just a flight attendant, Emily," he continued, his voice low and deliberate. "You were always meant to be here. You were always meant to play your part in this game. You just didn't know it yet." He paused and let the words hang in the air like poison slowly seeping into her veins. Emily's mind was spinning. She couldn't think. She couldn't make sense of any of this. Was this some sort of sick joke? Was Jonathan playing with her? Or was it something far darker? Was she just another piece in his game, another pawn in a world she couldn't even comprehend? "You think this is all an accident, don't you?" Jonathan's words were like daggers cutting through her confusion. The turbulence, the empty cockpit, the silence, it's all part of the plan, part of the test. And you, Emily, you're the one who failed. He stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with something that made her stomach churn. "You made the mistake of dismissing me. You made the mistake of thinking you could control this situation, and now you'll pay the price." Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her legs were weak, and she felt as if the world were closing in on her. She had no control, no way of escaping. She wanted to ask him, why her, why now? But the words wouldn't come. The fear was too overwhelming. The noise in the cabin grew louder. The passengers were still in a panic, but their voices sounded distant, as if they were part of a dream she couldn't wake up from. Jonathan continued to move toward her, his steps measured, deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. "I told you this was never a request, Emily," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "It was an order, and now you have no choice but to follow through with it, or you'll be lost like the others." Her eyes darted around the cabin, desperate for something, anything to help her escape, But the plane was shaking uncontrollably now, and the lights flickered once again. The air was thick with tension. The hum that had been present all along now seemed to reverberate through every inch of the aircraft. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, something alive, something controlling everything around her. Jonathan stopped in front of her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes. But it wasn't kindness or compassion. It was something darker, something predatory. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding. And the moment his hand touched her skin, she felt an electric shock run through her body, as if his touch was connected to something far greater than herself. "You're already a part of this now, Emily." Jonathan's voice was almost gentle as he leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "There's no going back. You've seen too much, you know, too much. And now you'll have to accept the consequences." He paused, and his smile grew wider, just like everyone else. The plane jolted again with an intensity that knocked her off her feet. She hit the floor hard. But before she could recover, Jonathan was gone, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the cabin as he disappeared into the shadows. She tried to push herself up, but the world was spinning, everything was spinning, and the last thing she remembered was the deafening hum that filled her ears before everything went dark.